Just yesterday you were buying things, trying to catch a sale, and today, parked outside your new home in an upscale neighborhood, is a brand new, expensive car, your dream come true. Who would have known that your grandmother had a sister who left the country many years ago and about whom you knew nothing? And that relative, feeling nostalgic for the homeland, suddenly remembered you and left you a decent inheritance. And now you have money in your pocket, and you're a rich person. But with wealth came a problem: how to protect your money. There are so many people around who want to clean out your pockets, from simple thieves and scammers to government bureaucrats with their inflation and defaults. So hiding it in the basement in a sack of potatoes is risky, and putting it in a bank for interest doesn't work. The returns are practically non-existent. And then you realize that along with the inheritance, you've also acquired a headache about not just protecting your millions, but making sure they grow. You, as a wealthy but not at all foolish person, begin to think big. After carefully studying the tricks of fraudsters, you start to understand that if someone promises a high return, say 50% or even 500%, it's clearly a trap, a scam. And here, new friends, from the wealthy circle to which you now belong, tell you that there are some reputable investment funds with professionals who only work with people from high society. There for sure you won't be deceived. And you, rich, happy, and content, of course, listen to your new neighbors. Look at how well they're living off their returns. This was the very strategy used by the creator of the largest financial pyramid scheme in the history of mankind. Who am I talking about? Of course, it's him, the man who deceived not simple people with no knowledge of economics, but sharks of the world economy for over 40 years. And his name is Bernard Madoff. Well, you might say, it's hard to believe that after all those decades, no one uncovered this fraud, not the authorities nor economists. Who later found out who the scammer was, and how much did Bernie manage to pocket during this time? Don't rush, I'll reveal the secret of the great con artist Madoff, but let's take it step by step. Bernie Lawrence Madoff, was a man who was both loved and feared. He became a symbol of greed and deception in the world of finance. His name entered history because of the largest fraudulent scheme which affected thousands of people. However, behind his crimes lies an incredibly interesting story. Bernie Madoff was born in 1938 in a Jewish family in Queens, one of the boroughs of New York City. He was the middle child in a modest Jewish family. His mother was a homemaker, and his father ran a small business, and the family's financial stability was always at risk. This may have shaped Madoff's desire to achieve wealth at any cost. A significant influence on his personality came from his father, Ralph Madoff, who spent his life striving for success but constantly failing. Ralph Madoff's life, in financial terms, was full of struggles and far from the success that Bernie would later enjoy. Trying to escape poverty, Ralph took any job, from being a plumber and laborer to working as a trader on the stock exchange. One day, he got lucky. Ralph secured a good position at a company that was a supplier of boxing equipment at the time. After some time, having saved a small capital, Ralph Madoff opened his own business. He tried to sell sporting goods. There are rumors that collectors can still find a punching bag from Ralph Madoff's store. The family bought a house in an upscale neighborhood of the time where many middle-class Jewish people lived, but Ralph's sports goods business went bankrupt, and he was forced to turn to investments. Even then, Ralph didn't always have smooth sailing, but he managed to maintain his social standing and pay for Bernie's education at a private school. Bernie wasn't interested in studying, and his father's financial troubles didn't catch his attention. He was a decent swimmer and was part of the school's swimming team. In his free time from competitions and school, he worked as a lifeguard on the beach, a job that his coach helped him secure. The money he earned from this job, he saved to invest in the future. During his studies, he met Ruth Alpern, a charming girl from a wealthy and religious Jewish family that was socially more prominent. Ruth's father was a financier who owned a respectable accounting firm in Manhattan. He would later bring the first clients to Bernie's business, recommending to his friends and acquaintances that they invest in the profitable venture. But more on that later. At this point, young Bernie, in 1959, earned a degree in political science and enrolled in Brooklyn Law School. He understood well that his father wouldn't be able to help him financially. Ralph was again struggling with financial difficulties, so Bernie had to try building his own business. And what do you need to start any business? Even a child knows the answer to this question. To start a business, you need money. So Bernie started taking on various jobs, not just as a lifeguard, but also as an installer of irrigation systems, a garbage collector, and basically any work he could get. At the same time, he married Ruth, thereby elevating his social status. Was this marriage for convenience or love? It's hard to say. Most likely, Bernie got lucky. His beloved not only helped him climb a couple of social rungs, but also genuinely loved him. Such things are rare, but they do happen. Bernie and Ruth were married for 50 years. And when Bernard saved $5,000, he began to understand that it wasn't worth risking his own money when he could manage other people's. And already in 1960, he created his first investment company. However, the money he had saved wasn't enough. What's $5,000? He needed 10 times that amount. So he turned to his father-in-law, Ruth's father, Saul Alpern, for help. Not only did Saul lend Bernie $50,000, but he also helped with clients, as I mentioned earlier. At first, Bernie's firm didn't even have its own office, and consisted of just 2 people, him and his wife Ruth. A little later, they rented a tiny office in Manhattan where they began to make deals. At first, everything was quite legal, but soon Bernie realized that the competition in this field was fierce, and he wanted a lot of money quickly. He decided to take a risk and enter the over-the-counter securities market. It's important to remember that the 1960s were a period of rapid stock market growth when prices were rising. Investor confidence was increasing, and there were many purchases. More and more people were entering the stock market. Businesses were becoming more confident, and they started investing more in their future and products, which meant there was a good chance to earn on the stock exchange. The first investors began to approach Bernie Madoff, relatives and friends of Saul Alpern, who had known the financier for a long time and were his clients. Bernie invested their money off-exchange in pink sheets. This brought a decent income, but didn't allow Madoff to compete with other companies on the exchange. And then Bernie decided to take a risk. In pursuit of huge profits and breaking the agreement, he invested all his clients' money in a very dubious company. If the crisis hadn't happened, Bernie might have succeeded, but in 1962, the market crashed, leaving young brokers like Bernie with huge losses. And here, the aspiring trader Madoff didn't give up. Breaking the law, he bought back stocks from clients at their original value, without telling them that, in reality, all his assets had burned up. Bernie spent nearly $30,000 on this, all he had earned in the last 2 years. But he didn't do it out of nobility. He did it to maintain his reputation, even through deception. It was at this point that he began to understand that you could make good money through fraud. What is reputation, and how important is it in life? I think there's no need to elaborate on the power of public opinion, how it can elevate or drown someone. For Madoff, reputation was the foundation of his entire future life. From the failures of his father, Ralph, Bernie learned an important lesson. To stay afloat, you need not only to take risks, but also to maintain face in society. Having survived the crisis and somehow preserving the client's profits, Bernie immediately became one of the best traders. Wealthy clients started flocking to him. Dreaming of getting rich, investors began to invest their money in Madoff's company. Then, during the investigation into Madoff's machinations, the financier Saul Alpern would also come under suspicion. The question would arise, did he know about his son-in-law's frauds? Did he intentionally bring him wealthy clients? But eventually they would conclude that, most likely, he did not. Bernie used him blindly, or else his father-in-law would never have brought his own brothers to him, who also later lost their savings. Let's try to figure out how Bernie began building his pyramid. Let's imagine a triangle with Madoff at the top. One side of this triangle is his father-in-law with relatives and friends. Alpern takes their money and hands it to Madoff, who, in theory, should invest it. On the other side of the triangle are employees who handle tax accounting and receive salaries. There is no legal violation here, at least not yet. Alpern and his partners attract clients who want to invest through Madoff. Soon, there are more than 70 of them. This forms the base of the triangle. Later, after 40 years, Bernie Madoff would say in court that he hadn't broken any laws back then, that he had actually made successful investments with good returns. Whether that's true or not, lawyers and economists are still debating, but let's move on. Anyone who's ever used a printer knows that this tricky device has a life of its own. There it is, printing calmly, and a minute later you hear, "Paper jam? Open the cover and remove the sheet." Yes, a paper jam. In the late 1970s, the stock market world in the U.S. faced an unusual problem, a real paper jam. No, it wasn't that the printer stopped working, but rather that brokerage firms were literally drowning in mountains of documents. Back then, things were much less digital than they are today. Every trade on the stock market was accompanied by physical documents, stocks, contracts, orders. After the deal was made, the documents needed to be processed, signed, registered, and sent to the owners. This worked fine when the market moved slowly, but in the 60s and 70s, the stock exchange was booming. More and more people were investing in stocks, and the number of trades grew sharply. Many brokerage firms couldn't afford to pay secretaries. They didn't have enough money, and the employees found themselves overwhelmed with stacks of paperwork. Offices turned into paper warehouses, where clerks sorted documents by hand day and night, trying not to get confused. The problem wasn't just the paper, but the process itself. Deals were mostly made by phone and took a few minutes, but processing the documents took several days, sometimes weeks. If a paper was lost or processed incorrectly, the deal could get stuck, leading to huge losses. Many brokerage firms went bankrupt, unable to handle the volume of paperwork. This event entered history as the paperwork crisis. That's when Bernard had a brilliant idea: to abandon paper documents and conduct trades electronically, something no one had done on the stock market before. His company was still small, with a small staff. This allowed him to accelerate the implementation of progressive technological innovations and avoid the paperwork crisis. After all, he didn't have many clients. Thanks to these innovations, Madoff's company reached a new level, attracting more and more new investors. People were getting tired of wandering through the paper jungle, waiting for their deals to be processed. The early 70s changed the concept of the stock exchange. It was no longer just a huge platform where securities were traded, with prices shouted by intermediaries, people in sharp suits. Now, the world was ruled by technological progress, and stock market trading found itself at the forefront of the computer revolution, becoming one of the first automated sectors of the economy. At this point, it's probably time to draw a line under Bernie Madoff's transparent and legal business, because the next chapter begins with dark and scandalous pages of his life. This is a murky swamp that sucked in the world's rich in search of easy money. Even government banks found themselves in this swamp, supporting the fraudster instead of sounding the alarm. Why did this happen? Did they miss it by accident, or were they deliberately turning a blind eye? Later, during the trials, a theory would emerge that the pyramid was deliberately designed by the U.S. government for certain purposes. However, this could neither be disproven nor proven. But automating the stock market was a requirement of the times, and the government couldn't stay on the sidelines, so they paid attention to Bernie Madoff, who was well-versed in this. And in 1971, to automate the over-the-counter securities market, NASDAQ, the National Association of Securities Dealers Automated Quotations, was created. Today, it is one of the largest stock exchanges in the world, where stocks of companies are bought and sold. Imagine a huge virtual market where millions of people and organizations trade stocks without leaving their offices or homes. Unlike traditional exchanges, NASDAQ doesn't have massive trading floors with shouting brokers. Everything operates through computers, and the first person to support and develop this system was Bernie Madoff. He bought equipment for his firms, investing a significant amount of money. And again, he did this to earn the status of a person who wasn't alien to technological progress and was actively promoting it. His business was thriving. This was facilitated by the use of electronic trading technology, while other funds were still operating the old-fashioned way. The technology Madoff was using became the foundation for NASDAQ. The business expanded, and realizing he couldn't handle it alone, Bernie brought relatives into his company, making it a family business. One of the first people he invited was his brother Peter, who was good with computers, then his children, his nephews Roger and Shauna, and later his two sons, Andrew and Mark. His wife Ruth held the title of vice president of the company, but didn't do any actual work there. But all family members were always just employees, never part of the company's board of directors, just regular managers with quite decent salaries. The most surprising thing was that the family members didn't even suspect the fraudulent scheme, as Bernie always skillfully avoided explanations on this matter. The firm was thriving, and Madoff was called the Pillar of Wall Street and one of the most progressive traders of his time. However, there were occasional scandals in the family. Relatives felt they were being underestimated and not trusted with higher positions. They didn't yet know that this situation would later save them from prison. Bernie calmly reacted to family grievances, continuing to run the company single-handedly, understanding that if his frauds were exposed, his loved ones would remain free. By analyzing his behavior, it can be assumed that he began building his pyramid not in the early 90s, as he later claimed in court, but already back in the 70s. After all, it wasn't for nothing that he so diligently hid everything from his family. Meanwhile, the U.S. was waging war with Vietnam. This sharply raised oil prices. Industry stalled. Mass unemployment began, followed by inflation. Thousands of companies, both small and large, went bankrupt. By 1979, inflation was growing rapidly, and it became completely pointless to keep money in the bank. Price growth was eating up savings faster than they earned interest. Stock exchanges were also in chaos. Prices were jumping like fleas on an old dog, meaning investing was risky too. What were people with large sums of money to do? Where could they find support? And here, an accounting firm enters the market, offering investments with a modest but stable return of up to 8%, which was independent of the market. Wealthy people trying to preserve their money flocked to this firm, especially after learning that it was run by Bernie Madoff, a reliable person, technically savvy with government backing, and always returning clients' money. There was also a psychological element at play. Madoff made clients feel that the doors of his firm were open not to everyone, but only to a select few. This made his offers even more tempting. By 1980, Madoff's company became known for its guarantee of an annual return of over 10% and became the largest trader on the New York Stock Exchange, completing about 5% of all transactions. Bernie began to act. He bought a house on one of the islands, flying to work by helicopter with his wealthy neighbors. Soon, his fellow passengers became Bernie's investors. And a little later, Bernie joined an elite club in Palm Beach, where he bought a luxurious house. Want to know how much the membership fee for this club costs? Well, it's not a small amount, $300,000. It's immediately clear who Madoff was dealing with. Surprisingly, the club members also became clients of Madoff's company and encouraged their friends to invest their money in his firm. In general, wherever Madoff appeared, people who wanted to increase their wealth by investing in Bernie's company were always nearby. Why did experienced and seemingly intelligent people trust their money to a fraudster? Let's break it down. Thanks to Ronald Reagan, who became the President of the United States, the economy began to grow, which had a positive effect on the investment market. By the mid-'80s, Madoff's brokerage firm had a charter capital of more than $18 million. It made it to the list of the top 100 companies in the securities market. Bernie entered the boards of directors of many funds and even became the chairman of NASDAQ in the 1990s. He actively donated money to charity, which strengthened his reputation as a good financier. All of this increased his trust among clients. By this time, traditional stock exchanges, under the pressure of electronic technologies, had ceased to exist, and the richest time for Madoff arrived. Now he was the owner of luxurious homes in New York and the south of France. His yacht, named Bull, symbolized his confidence and strength, as he claimed. Everyone thought that now the company had nothing to fear. Profits were growing, and the press was constantly enhancing the image of the great broker. But in October 1987, the U.S. stock market index sharply dropped and the over-the-counter market collapsed. Panic began on the exchanges. Many investors, trying to save their money, rushed to withdraw it from funds, even under the worst conditions. However, Madoff's firm miraculously stayed afloat. He continued making deals as the company was well equipped with computers that processed information very quickly. Madoff started trading index options, financial instruments based on a group of stocks grouped by certain criteria. In the 90s, the market became stable again, and their effectiveness decreased. That's when, according to Bernie, he organized his pyramid. What is the Madoff pyramid? It's a type of fraud known as a Ponzi scheme, where payments to old investors are made using the money from new clients. The secret to Madoff's success was his trustworthiness. He promised stable income and showed impressive profits that supposedly grew regardless of market conditions. Many clients didn't even suspect that their money was never invested in real assets. Madoff's firm, Madoff Investment Securities, as well as its owner, were highly respected and considered a symbol of reliability and stability. It was also very attractive that no management fees were charged to clients. People trusted Bernie, so they calmly handed over their money, expecting a return of 12 to 13% per year. And this was true, but only on paper. In reality, Bernie used the investments to buy government bonds with a return of 2% annually. If people ever had doubts, Madoff confidently and calmly offered to return their invested money. This psychological technique almost always worked, and investors, reassured, continued to trust him with their funds. Among his victims were charitable organizations, wealthy celebrities such as Steven Spielberg, actor Kevin Bacon, and even financial experts. Bernie personally studied each new client carefully, and there were even instances where he would refuse a client without explaining why. But this only increased his reputation in the eyes of his clients. The most interesting thing is that Madoff didn't only deceive individual investors, but also large banks, including the Swiss UBS and the Spanish Banco Santander. The financial pyramid operated without failure, continued to generate income for many years, and hardly raised any suspicions. The client's money went into safe investments like real estate and the oil industry, while the excess funds were spent on personal needs, elite goods, cars, planes, and travel. The sky above Madoff investment securities was clear until a financial analyst named Harry Markopolos appeared on the horizon. At the end of 1999, Harry, working at one of the major financial companies, was tasked with studying Madoff's company's success and the possibility of replicating it. Markopolos began working on this task, but just a few hours later, after reviewing the documentation, he began to suspect that he had encountered a sophisticated fraud scheme. The numbers just didn't add up to the ones Madoff reported. The analyst was certain that such a profit could not be obtained legally. In his opinion, no financiers or mathematicians could achieve the level of success that Bernie had reached. Harry Markopolos openly declared that Madoff was a fraudster, and he could prove it. There weren't enough index options in the world to generate the profit Madoff was reporting. But no one listened to him. Despite the accusations, Madoff's company continued to operate and lasted for more than 7 more years. How did this happen? Well, let's start by saying that although Markopolos was a brilliant analyst, he completely lacked people skills. When he approached the Securities and Exchange Commission, he accused them of not noticing the fraud for all these years, but they didn't even listen to him. I think it would be hard for you, too, to have a constructive conversation with someone who enters your home and immediately declares that you're an idiot. Harry sent his investigations 4 times, but neither federal authorities nor the press paid attention to him. He even published a book about his futile attempts to prove that Madoff was a blatant fraud. Then various commissions began flooding Madoff's office with checks, but the financial flows into the firm hadn't stopped yet, and this helped solve all the problems. In 2000, with the market stable, Madoff had a buyer willing to acquire his company for $1 billion. Of course, Bernie refused, as the paperwork would immediately reveal the fraud. Later, while in prison, Madoff admitted in one of his rare interviews that the owners of major American banks knew about the fraud but were highly reluctant to see the collapse of Madoff's company because many banks were laundering money through his firm. Here's an interesting fact. Madoff had a secret room in his office, known as the boiler room. It was here that a small team of employees falsified reports, creating the illusion of stable income. But in 2008, the global financial crisis marked the beginning of the end for Madoff. Investors began withdrawing their money en masse, and Bernie could no longer hide the fraud. The company had only $700 million in its account, but $7 billion had to be returned. He tried to sort everything out, but there was not enough time or strength left. In December of that same year, his sons came to his office, concerned about their father's condition. It was then that Bernie confessed to them that his business was a giant pyramid scheme. Shocked, his sons, fearing they would be accused of complicity, immediately reported it to federal authorities, and the very next day, Bernie was arrested on charges of securities fraud. The largest financial pyramid in history collapsed. Bernie did not make excuses or attempt to escape, and in March 2009, he pled guilty to all the charges against him. A U.S. court sentenced Madoff to 150 years in prison, the maximum possible sentence. Madoff was sent to prison in North Carolina, and the assets of his company were sold off to compensate for the losses. But even in prison, enterprising Madoff did not get bored. He set up a hot chocolate business. The clever fraudster simply bought up all the chocolate bars in the prison store and then sold them to other inmates at a higher price. Surprisingly, even while incarcerated, Madoff was respected and had authority, as no one had ever swindled the wealthiest people and the government for so long. Here they love thieves, and I, as strange as it sounds, am one of the most successful thieves in history, said Bernie. Bernard Madoff, despite his constant deception, lived a life of wealth and luxury, but the price for it was too high. He was burdened with a sense of guilt toward his family, though it was his sons who turned him into the authorities, preventing him from finishing the job. They even refused to post bail or meet with their father. Only his wife Ruth visited Madoff in prison, but when the sons found out, they forbade her from doing so. They gave the woman a choice, either the children and grandchildren or Bernie. The woman chose the former, but the hardest part was yet to come. In 2010, his older son, Mark, overwhelmed by depression over the public's disbelief in the son's innocence regarding their father's scheme, was found dead in his New York apartment. In 2014, his younger son, Andrew, died of lymphoma, and Bernie Madoff's 87-year-old sister was killed by her husband, though whether it had anything to do with Bernie is unclear. Madoff's lawyers submitted a petition for his release due to his deteriorating health, citing chronic illnesses. However, the court rejected the petition. The fraudster of the century, Bernard Madoff, died in prison in 2021 at the age of 82, surrounded by fellow inmates. His widow now lives near her grandchildren in a small town in New England. The story of the largest financial pyramid came to an end. Its creator admitted to deceiving investors and regulators for 20 years. He had no real investment deals. Madoff simply moved money between bank accounts, paying clients their income from new deposits. Among the victims were not only the wealthiest people in the U.S. and celebrities, but also the world's largest banks. Preliminary estimates suggest that his fraudulent scheme affected up to 3 million people, with total losses amounting to approximately $64.8 billion, making it the largest scam in financial history. The story of Bernie Madoff is a lesson in greed, trust, and the consequences of deceit. Despite his genius in manipulation, he destroyed not only the lives of thousands of people, but also his own family. His example reminds us that even the most brilliant scams are eventually exposed. So, if you ever feel the urge to multiply your wealth, be careful not to fall for such fraudsters. Stay vigilant, and then you can peacefully relax on the Bahamas, not worrying about your investments.